Hello everyone, and welcome to our next video for video game programming. I apologize if the audio is a little bit worse today. I've got a bit of a cold, and I'm also recording from my built-in microphone rather than my headset mic. So there may be a little bit more background noise, but hopefully the sound will come out all right, and you guys can hear me okay. So today we're going to be talking about three different topics. We're going to be further defining what a model or a mesh is. We're also going to be talking about materials and textures and how we use those to apply color and shading and more interesting look to our game objects. So before in class or in the last video, we talked about what a game object was, and we talked a little bit about how game objects have containers and properties that specify things about them, and then they have the shape themselves that occupies three-dimensional space. So I'm going to go ahead and add a cube. And when we take a look at this cube, there's a few different pieces about the cube. Last time we talked about how a game object contains both a transform value as well as properties and behaviors. So the properties tell us several things about the game object. But this piece right here, this piece that says cube mesh filter, this describes the physical shape and boundaries of the object. So a game object represents the entire container or the entire thing, right? This cube, how it exists in space and what its behaviors are, how it collides with things, how it looks, all that is bundled together as a game object. The cube itself is what in 3D modeling we would call a model or a mesh. There is a slight difference between what mesh and model really mean, but for this class we can use them interchangeably. So I may say model, I may say mesh, but in both cases I'm referring to the physical cube itself. So when we deal with a model or a mesh, there are things that we can apply to that model to make it more interesting looking, to actually give it some color or some different shading. And to do that, we need three things. We need a material, and you can see that I've added some folders down here in my Project Explorer. So we need a material, we need a texture, and we also need what is called a shader. So I've got a little diagram here. And I want to show you guys what this diagram how this diagram relates our model, so imagine this is our cube, with the materials, textures, and shaders. So a material basically has all of the data that represents how a model looks. So the model of an object is the cube itself, but the material is the layer wrapping the cube that describes how the cube appears. The model is broken down into two components. There's a texture, which is the actual color or pattern that is displayed on our cube, and then a shader describes how that texture is applied. So it's almost like the texture is the what, and the shader is the how. Okay? So right now we're going to create a material and see how the textures and shaders play together. So I'm going to go into my Materials tab, and I'm going to create a new material right here. And I'm going to call this new material brick wall, and you'll see why in a second. But if I click this material and I go to my inspector, I want to go over some of the options that we have for materials. Most of these options we aren't going to care about. A lot of this stuff is beyond our what is necessary for us to use in this class. However, the ones I'm going to highlight now are ones that you're probably going to want to take note of. So albedo, this guy right here, this represents the color or texture of our object. So in our diagram, I don't know why this keeps happening. In our diagram, the texture or albedo is the what. That's our texture right here. Now notice that underneath shader, we have what's called the standard shader. We're going to always leave this alone. The standard shader has enough options to do what we want it to do. So we're going to leave that. Albedo allows us to change the color of our material. So I could make the material red if I wanted to. I could use the color wheel to do any color I want. I could do that on my cube as well. But we're going to see how I can take the brick wall and apply it to the cube. So I'm going to leave that white for now. And what I'm going to end up doing is applying an image texture to this albedo section. But the key thing to remember is that this funny word just means whatever is drawn on the surface of the object, or on the surface of the mesh. Metallic does just like it sounds. This slider makes something look more or less metallic. And where that really comes into play is the smoothness value. So I don't know how well you can see it in the video, but down here we can kind of see that there's a little bit of a glow on one side of the material. Smoothness is basically how much reflective light is, or how much light is reflected by the material. So if I take the smoothness value and I move it down, I'm going to get a flatter look, and the object itself is going to look more dull. If I increase the smoothness value, I can see that I'm getting this weird bright orb here. This is coming from the fact that almost all the light is being reflected by the origin point, or the point at which the light is coming from, and then there's the shadow over here. So playing with smoothness is a good way, and we'll see examples of it better once we get the material actually applied to the mesh. But for now, we're going to put smoothness down to 0, because my goal here is to make a brick wall texture, and bricks aren't very bright, right? They're pretty dull surfaces. So we're going to drop smoothness all the way down. The only other one that we care about in this section is the normal map. Normal map allows us to change the roughness of an object. It also allows us to change how light plays across an object, and we're going to see what that looks like in just a few moments. So skip all these. So far we've covered albedo, metallic, and smoothness. And normal map. We're going to jump all the way down to tiling. Tiling controls how many times the texture is repeated. So if we were dealing with brick walls and we wanted our bricks to be smaller, we would increase these values so that they are tiled more often. So this controls how much repeating is done of our texture. And the rest of this we can ignore for now. Those are the main components that we need in a material. We need to be able to define what the material looks like, how shiny or reflective the material is, how rough and shaded it looks, and then how it is tiled. And the rest of it for now we don't care about. The key thing to understand about a texture when it is applied to a material is that the texture is going to wrap around this cube. So I'm going to go to my assets folder. I'm going to go to textures, and you can see that I've already pulled in just a plain image. This is just a regular JPEG of some bricks that I got from the internet. So this brick wall texture is what I want to wrap around my cube. Now, you may be asking yourself, how do we take a two-dimensional image and apply it to a three-dimensional object? Well, one of the best analogies I saw is imagine a soup can. So let's say Campbell's soup. And we are going to look at an image of a soup can. So this Campbell's soup can has a label that has been wrapped around it, right? If we were to cut that label and lay it out flat, we would have basically a two-dimensional image. And that's what's going on in Unity. We're taking a two-dimensional image and we are wrapping it around our cube. What we'll find is that we can actually take more complex objects and create more complex maps, or textures rather, that map to the objects in unique ways. And we're going to look at some examples of those later on in a follow-up video. But for today, we're only interested in simple shapes and simple textures. Okay. So we are going to take our material, the brick wall material, and we want to get this material to have our texture that we applied. So let me do what I just did again so you guys can see it. Remember that albedo is the thing that is going to control what is displayed on our shape. So this little dot next to albedo, I selected that, and I selected brick. And now the brick texture, the brick image that I downloaded, you can see in my preview, is being wrapped around my sphere. Materials are always displayed by default as a sphere. We won't see how it actually is projected onto our shape until we give our cube this material. So let's do that. Now, one thing that I want to point out here, why did I bother to make a material separately? Why didn't I just click on the cube and then open up the default material and do whatever I wanted with it? Well, the first reason is that Unity won't let us, which may seem silly, but Unity is trying to promote a good design decision. Unity is saying you should create your materials separately because then if you want to change out materials, it becomes really easy, right? I'm not making modifications on the shape itself, I'm making modifications on the material, or I'm changing materials. So I'm separating what a brick wall looks like from the object or the mesh that will actually be textured as a brick wall. So let's get this material hooked up. Okay, we're going to take the brick wall material, we're going to drop it onto our cube, and notice that our shader changed from brick wall, or changed from default shader to brick wall. And now we can see that our texture has been applied appropriately. I'm going to go into our game view here, and actually I'm going to move our camera a little bit closer to our cube so that we can see our texture a little bit better. So there we go. We have a cube that has been textured as a brick wall. And I'm going to move this to the side a little bit so we can see the side of it. Let's check it one more time. So notice how the image is evenly wrapped around our block. So once we get to this seam here, this edge, the texture just continues and is wrapped around that side. It's wrapped around the top and bottom. So we get an even distribution of this object. Now I'm going to go to my brick wall texture, and I'm going to change a couple of things. I'm going to select a normal map. Let's see. I want this guy as my normal map. Not marked as a normal map. Okay, that's not what we want. Let's take this off of here. None. Let's do default checker. So we can see that, I think default checker is the one I want. So we can see that the normal map is applying, it's not necessarily applying a texture specifically, but it's applying a way in which the lighting changes on our object. So notice the shape of this default particle asset here, this default particle texture. What I'm doing is applying a map on top of my image that determines how light plays across the cube. And you can see that it changes the way that my cube looks without actually changing the material, or the texture rather, underneath. Normally we would use this to create more natural looking shadows, but I don't have an example of one here. But this would be used to make potentially ridges or cuts in the surface that make shadows that look like the object has certain contours. But the big important thing is just to understand that it's there and it affects how light plays across the object. It doesn't actually affect the texture itself. All right, so let's remove this guy for now because it looks silly on our object. And we're going to look at some assets that we can pull in a later video that have more concrete examples of a normal map. The key thing to remember here, if you've taken 3D art and animation, in that class we talked about how normal maps were used, or normal geometry was used to create roughness in our surface, and that's no longer the case. Normal maps and normal geometry are not the same thing. So when we're looking through here, if we're thinking about Blender versus Unity, these guys are not quite the same, and we want to make sure we make that distinction. So we've got our texture that we've created, we've got that texture hooked up to a material, and we've got that material placed upon an object. The last thing that I want to point out, note that when I made changes to the material, it changed my cube. I didn't have to change the cube directly. This is really important because it means that if I want all brick walls to look the same, or if I want all my brick walls to have the same lighting or the same tiling, then I can apply my material to several different objects and change the material, and it'll change all of them. So this is another really powerful reason why we create our material separately, so that everything that has that material gets the updates to the material once we're done. Okay, so hopefully this gives you guys a little bit better idea of how we might create objects that look more like real-world things, or create objects that are more interesting than just meshes with a single solid color. Thanks for watching.